Okay, now we are going to transition, and if you're here today, you're very lucky because this is a brand new thing we're trying today. We're taking a break from the lectionary. If you've been with us, we've been following the church lectionary and looking at the scriptures each week, and today we're taking a break, and we're calling today Storytellers Sunday, okay? And I'm just curious, raise of hands, do any of you have just a really good storyteller in your family? Extended families. Yep, a few of you. I had one growing up. His name was Uncle Kevy, and not his given name. That's what I called him. Uncle Kevy was an amazing storyteller. And I can remember as a kid, the adults would be having boring conversation like adults do. And I'd just be sitting around. I wasn't interested at all. But then I could catch this moment when Uncle Kevin would start telling a story. He'd say, hey, I got to tell you about this thing that happened. He'd start this narrative, and it was like my brain just changed focus, and I was drawn in to this story. And you guys know this. There's no shortage of science and books and TED Talks about the power of stories these days. Stories not just inspire us and move us, but they're more memorable than facts or data. They're a way to pass down culture and legacy. In a sense, the Bible is one long story as a collection of shorter stories. And it's through these stories that our guards, or we sort of let our guard down. We allow our spirit to hear truth in a new way. Jesus, of course, often used stories, we call them parables, to communicate these difficult truths. But I want to share with you one of my favorite examples from Scripture of the power of story. So you might know this story. King David had committed some horrible acts, some horrible sins. And he's like a lot of humans. He's sort of blind, and he's closed off to the terrible things he's done. So there's this prophet named Nathan. And Nathan's so brilliant. Instead of Nathan just going to him and like saying, hey, you are wrong, let me tell you why, which might have caused some anger and defensiveness from a king, Nathan instead, he tells a story. I want to look at this together. It's from 2 Samuel. He says, there are two men in a certain town, one rich, the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little lamb he had bought. He raised it and grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like dog. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. So he tells this story. And then David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity. And then Nathan said, you are the man. It's brilliant. It's brilliant. And this is the power of stories, right? We sort of lock into this narrative, and God changes our hearts and our minds. Our minds are open to change in a new way. We're open to empathy and understanding. And so for us at Highway, we've been wanting to highlight stories more and more in our community. And so we're going to try ways to do this at different events. We're going to maybe quarterly do Storyteller Sundays like today, and with the goal of greater connection, greater understanding, and empathy for each other. One of these events coming up in September are what we call racial autobiographies. Now, these are a chance to hear someone's story specifically about their racial identity and how that's affected their life and their spirituality. So save the dates for those. We'll have a place to RSVP. I went to one of these last year, and it was so powerful. It was so moving. I'd love for you to be a part of that. But today, we're going to hear from 2 storytellers. We're going to hear from Fred Martinez and Cris, Otonari. And today's theme actually came from our Tuesday morning prayer group. So every week at 8 a.m. in that room right there, a group of us have been praying for our nation and just praying that God would bring more shalom and peace and love. And specifically, we've been focusing on refugees and immigrants and just all of the vitriol that's taken place in our world. And so, as a group, we wanted to have a way to share to our broader community how close this issue is to us. So often, this is one of those issues you see on TV, and it seems like it's way out there, but it's close. People in our congregation, in our neighborhoods, they have cultural stories that we can learn from. So our two stories today are stories of how immigration has affected their families and their own narrative. So we're going to hear from our first storyteller, and can we give it up for Fred Martinez, everybody?
This is the church outfit right here, yeah. Black and tan. We planned that. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Fred, if I haven't met you before. My wife, Teresa, and I have been coming to Highway for 24 years. And I think we've been to sort of every iteration of Highway throughout that time. And we started when we were in middle school. I know, I don't look that old. No, I want to share a story with you, or actually some stories today with you, as Adam mentioned. And I took a class, a leadership class, at work, and we read a book by Brene Brown. I don't know if you're familiar with Brene, but she's very popular in the business world, and she talked about vulnerability and how that can be a strength. And when I was asked to do this, I thought, I'm going to be very vulnerable, but if you can't be vulnerable in church, where can you be vulnerable, right? So we'll go for it from there. So if you can put the slide up there. There it is. All right, so this is a document. You can see at the top, maybe it says U.S. Department of Labor, Immigration Service. And this is from my grandfather. My grandfather, Simón Carrasco Martinez, was born in Fresnillo, Zacatecas in Mexico in 1906. And Zacatecas is the state. It's kind of right in the middle of Mexico, it's kind of a landlocked part of the country there. But his parents both passed away before he was a young teenager. And as you can see from this document, he crossed in 1922 up in the kind of right-hand corner there through El Paso, Texas. So they came up the middle of Mexico through Juarez and through El Paso. He was being looked over by his aunt at the time. So his aunt brought him and his younger brother, my great-uncle Carlos, and they came to the United States. And that time in Mexico in the early 1900s, the revolution was taking place, and it probably wasn't a very safe place. And I'm guessing that they were young teenagers at the time becoming men, and she probably thought it would be a good idea to get out of there for them. So Grandpa Simon, he worked in agriculture all of his life. They moved to the Central Valley of California, and he spent time picking, pruning, packing, whatever was in season. The family was truly a migratory, part of the migratory labor movement at that time. So they moved up and down the state. They even came up to this area at one point in time, but most of it was down in the Central Valley. And he was always mechanically inclined, so he learned to work on tractors and eventually became a tractor driver and a mechanic and spent a lot of his time doing that. And my dad would tell me stories about he would go into a shed and he would see my grandfather with this tractor just completely pulled apart, parts everywhere, and he had no idea how he was going to put it back together, but eventually my grandfather would get that back because that's what he did. When World War II started, Grandpa Simon went to volunteer. He wanted to fight for the country that he had now adopted as his own, so he wanted to fight for the U.S., and by that time he had already become a father of four. I guess at that point in time, there was a rule maybe against allowing a father with that much responsibility at home to go and fight because he was denied service, entry into the service, but he did try. He kept working, and eventually he brought 9 children into the world, busy man, along with my grandmother Lucy. And here's a picture. So this is my family. This is actually my college graduation, which was a big family celebration. First generation folks getting through college, and there's my grandparents there in the middle, and their children. And then the next picture. These are my grandparents, and this was their 65th wedding anniversary. That's 6 and a 5, yeah. Yeah, they lived for a long time, and they were married for a long time. And, you know, my memories growing up always kind of are surrounded by the thought of celebrations and milestones for my grandparents, and birthdays, and you know, anniversaries. And it's just really, you know, a great memory to have. There was always mariachi music. There was always just food and good times. And even though sometimes we were just dancing on the dirt floor, it was fun. When I was a kid, we'd go and visit my grandparents, and the TV was always on, and it was always the Spanish channel, and there was usually soccer or boxing on. And Grandpa proudly displayed a map of Mexico in the house, and he would point to where he had come from. He had a green card that allowed him to work, but he never became a citizen. And I never knew that until after he had passed away. And because he had never become a citizen, he had never gone back to visit the country that he was born in, that he had come from. And frankly, he was afraid that he was not going to be able to come back if he had gone back. And currently, he'd probably be right? We know that folks who aren't citizens right now are you know, being looked at to be taken away. And so, you know, if you look at his picture that I just showed you, he certainly looks like, you know, a Mexican man. I mean, he's got the features, and you know, it's something right now that people who look like him are living in fear. And I wonder if he were still alive today, what we would do as a family. Would we hide him? Would we keep him from doing some of the things that he loved to do? He always loved to be out and about. My grandmother certainly always had him out and about. She was a little bit younger than he was, and they never, you know, missed going and doing things. And so I wonder about that. I grew up in a small town in the Central Valley, and when I was a kid, before I started school, I remember my mom getting up while it was still dark outside. My mom was 5 feet tall at best. She was a small woman, but she was the strongest, hardest working woman I've ever known. She grew up in the fields, and it didn't matter to her at that point in time. She still worked in the fields because we needed the money. So she would get up, you know, when it was dark. There was a local labor contractor that lived down the street. They were family friends. And she would climb into the back of a pickup truck, packed full with all of the other workers. They were all wearing long sleeves and bandanas and hats to protect themselves from the elements that they were going to face throughout the day. And she picked and cleaned cotton, grapes, beets, again, whatever was in season, right? And we lived in a neighborhood that was primarily Latino, Mexican American, Mexican. And there were times when she would come home and she would tell us that there had been a Border Patrol raid out where they were working. And, you know, obviously there were people that were impacted from our neighborhood there because they were there working with them. And just like I told you about, you know, my grandparents, a lot of folks had the same backgrounds, right? And so, you know, whether or not they had become citizens yet, it wasn't necessarily the case. So they'd be taken back. And one day, my sisters and I were outside in our front yard, and we saw the Border Patrol van parked down the street at the end of our street. And so we knew something was up, and we were outside kind of, you know, trying to figure out what was going on. And all of a sudden, we see this young man. He couldn't have been, you know, late teens, early 20s, running down the street. And I still remember I could hear he was wearing his work boots, and I could hear his big boots clunking on the street, the asphalt. And I looked at him, and I saw just the fear in his eyes. I mean, his eyes were this big. I was probably 8 or 9 years old at the time. But it's something I'll never forget, that fear that I saw that day with him. And my older sister called out to him in Spanish and said, try running that way. And don't know if he was picked up or not. But, again, a memory that is going to stay with me forever. I was very fortunate growing up. My parents provided everything for me, and I got a chance to go to school actually just down the street here at Stanford. It was a real blessing. And, someone coming from my background, I really appreciated everything that took to get there. And, I'm a college-educated professional now, living the American dream, right? But that, in and of itself, hasn't kept me, in my experience, from being on the wrong side of some of these stories. So, first time was my senior year in college at Stanford. I had a job at the library, and I had a check to deposit. So I left my class, and I went to the ATM, which was at the Student Union. It was up a flight of stairs on the outside of the building. Went up there, made my deposit, and when coming down the stairs, I looked out, and I saw a police officer, a cop, looking straight at me. And I had this feeling just overcome, like, this is really odd. I know I didn't do anything, but that guy definitely has a purpose in what he's looking at. And so, sure enough, as I went down the stairs towards my bike, he came right for me. And you can imagine, my heart was beating faster. My heart's beating faster right now as I'm telling you this story. My heart was racing, and I was going through my brain, like, what did I do? Like, what, why is this guy coming for me? And I walked to my bike, and he stopped me, questioned me, detained me, and he said I fit the description of someone who had been harassing women. And he called over the radio, looked at my ID, and the whole deal. And as it was happening, sorry, I just couldn't help but think about some of the other things that my family had been through as well. It was very scary, and it certainly wasn't a position that I thought I'd ever find myself in. He was actually kind of a jerk about it, to be completely honest. He told me, don't be surprised if another officer stops you on the way home. And I was like, great. That's really reassuring. But I got through it. Fast forward a few years, about 10 or 12 years, and I was driving my daughter to preschool. Driving through suburban Sunnyvale, nice little quiet side street there. And we're driving towards the school, and I passed a cop car. And, something that happens all the time, right? Immediately, he pulls a U-turn. And I had that feeling again from what I'd had before. And again, why is this guy coming after me? What did I do? I had no idea, obviously. He got right behind me and followed me for a couple of turns, and actually pulled into the preschool parking lot and hit me with the lights. And I told my daughter, this police officer's going to come and talk to us. I hope that's all he's going to do. And, he looked at my ID. Again, I apparently have that look. And I looked like a suspect that they were looking for. And so, these incidents in my past make me wonder now, could that happen again? So, I just wanted to share these stories with you today. And I think, I appreciate being a part of this community. And as Adam mentioned, the prayer group that we've had on Tuesdays. And, I obviously lament what we see in our country happening today with my community. And, when I see these stories about what's going on, based on the stories that I've just told you today, I see my grandfather, I see my mother, I see myself, and I see my old neighbors and everybody, that looks like me. So I just hope and pray that we can figure out a way to end some of the stuff that's going on. That's my story. Thank you all for listening, and I'll pass it on to Cris.
Thanks, Fred. Wow, that's a tough act to follow. You can tell I got the reverse memo on the dress code for today. Well, as Adam said, I'm Cris, and I'm a third, fourth generation Japanese American, or what we would call a sansei yonsei. And the third generation is on my father's side. So my paternal grandparents were the first generation to immigrate to America. My grandpa immigrated in 1912 and my grandma in 1929. They made their home in Seattle, where my grandpa worked in restaurants, sales, maintenance, and ran a dry cleaning business. My dad's sister was sent back to Japan in 1935, where she remained for 15 years before she returned to the US. This was a common practice among Japanese immigrants, where they would send family members back to Japan, usually for school, and they were raised by grandparents or other relatives. And since my dad was born in 1937, I just realized that means he never met or knew his sister until he was 13 years old. On my mom's side, my great-great-grandpa is the one who first immigrated to the US around 1887. He was married and had a son in Japan, and then the family moved to America so he could learn how to make wine. But instead, he learned about farming and ended up working in the fields. And my great-grandpa must have returned to Japan at some point because he got married in Japan and then moved to America in 1906. They had all 6 of their children in America, and my grandpa was the oldest, born in 1907. Because my great-grandpa was considered an alien, he wasn't allowed to own land, but he leased land and he worked in the fields. He later bought land in San Martin using his late son's name because his son was a naturalized citizen. My great-grandpa and his family went back and forth between the US and Japan a couple more times, at one point leaving my grandpa in Japan to be raised by his grandmother. When my grandpa was 21 years old, he went back to America, but he ran into a problem. There was somebody already living in the US under his name. And so it turns out that his uncle was trying to get into the country, but he used my grandfather's name because my grandfather was a citizen by birthright. But they worked it out, and he settled into the US, and he ended up meeting his bride a couple years later. So his bride was my maternal grandma, and she was born in El Viso in 1911. When she was 6, she and her sister were sent back to Japan for school, where they were raised by their grandparents for the next 10 years. When she was 16, the rest of her family finally went back to Japan, but just 3 years later, she was sent to America for an arranged marriage. She was terrified to leave Japan, but she caved into this Japanese concept of shigata kanai, which means it cannot be helped. This thing has already been predetermined. And that's usually paired with this concept of gaman. You hold everything in and you persevere with dignity as much as possible. She said, I boarded the huge ship called Chichibu Maru, not knowing anyone, going to a strange and different country where I don't speak their language, and I kept all my feelings inside, which were bursting to cry out loud, Please don't make me do this. I felt so small and helpless. She thought about jumping over, but that would bring dishonor and shame to her family. So she endured the 2-week-long trip to Angel Island, where she was detained for inspection. She lived in the Bay Area for the rest of her life, but would never return to Angel Island because of her traumatic memories there. I don't know how long she was there or what she endured, but I think it was really hard. And the day after she was finally released, she married my grandpa in 1931. Life was hard, especially for my grandma because of the patriarchal nature of the Japanese culture. She often sacrificed her own well-being for the sake of the family, and she worked the hardest of anyone, including the period where she had 4 children. The land my great-grandpa had purchased in Palo Alto was blighted because of the salt beds, so they moved around to other parcels that were maybe not totally legally obtained by my great-grandpa, growing and harvesting fruit that paid 20 cents per hour for labor. Eventually, they figured out how to grow produce on that land in Palo Alto, which they sold to local markets, and they were able to sustain a living. That is until the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Suddenly, my mom's family experienced terrible prejudice and hatred. Japanese Americans were being brutally beaten, sometimes to death. California was considered high risk for espionage, and an 8 p.m. curfew was implemented. If Japanese Americans even looked toward Moffett Field, which is right in our backyard, they were taken into custody as spies. Then Executive Order 9066 was signed by President Roosevelt on February 19th, 1942. This led to the incarceration of over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, and over like 2/3 of them were American citizens. These camps were surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, including snipers in watchtowers. Because my dad lived in Seattle, his family was taken to Minidoka Camp in Idaho. That's what it looked like. And then in the next slide, there's a picture at camp, and the people that are circled, no, you can't read the names, but it includes my grandpa and grandma, my dad and his 2 sisters who are kind of sitting in the front. One sister, Kay, was not there because she's the one who was in Japan. So she did not know anything really about what happened in Minidoka, and we don't have a lot of information on what happened in my dad's history. My mom, however, did document a lot about the camp experience before my grandparents passed. Her family tried to evade the order by moving to Newcastle in Placer County. Before they left, they destroyed photos and mementos, and they tried to sell some of their assets, but of course they were taken advantage of. People would say, "Oh, we'll pay you later," and that never happened. And then on July 11th, 1942, the military told my mom's family they would have to go to camp. So the next day, with 1 day's notice, they took a train to Tule Lake, California, with only what they could carry. Tule Lake was a high security camp. That's Tule Lake. And it's one where problem people were often sent. So upon arrival, they were told to complete a long questionnaire that contained these 2 questions. It was a loyalty questionnaire. Number 27, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? And number 28, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any and all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor, to any other foreign government, power, or organization? You can probably see the dilemma here, right? Fight for the country that is imprisoning your family, or denounce your country of origin and be stateless. The men who answered no to both questions or refused to answer were called no-no boys, and that was my grandpa. My grandpa was so angry he refused to answer, and he was put in a special jail for high-risk prisoners. He was separated from his family for 3 months, and my grandma had no idea where he was or if he was even alive. The camp location was barren, as you saw in the picture, and it was extremely hot or cold. They had no privacy, plumbing, or furniture, and they lost all sense of dignity. But my grandparents made do with their circumstances, holding paid jobs in camp and galvanizing the community. This is a photo of some of the instructors at camp. My grandma's the one, Hatsumi, with the little arrow pointing to her. She was a sewing instructor, and she earned money in camp teaching people how to sew. My grandfather was a block manager, so he really was kind of the galvanizer there. Well, the war ended in 1945, and in February 1946, my mom's family was finally allowed to leave camp. That's a picture of them before they left. My mom's the youngest. My grandparents bought a car with the $600 my grandmother had saved up, but no one would rent to them. There was still a lot of discrimination and hatred, and it was common to see signs that read, "No Japs wanted." After they finally found a place to live, they settled into jobs like gardening, housekeeping, and sewing. And later, they ended up getting into the flower business, which was lucrative enough for them to build a home in Palo Alto and allow them to retire at 62 and 58. This story hasn't captured all of the emotions and trauma my family experienced. In part, it's because Nisei, or the second generation, especially those who were in the camps, are known as the silent generation. Many of them refuse to talk about their camp experience. And I can see how the trauma affected my grandparents and my parents. And since I know that trauma is kind of passed down through generations, I know it affects me. You may have picked up from my story that some of my family members acquired property or immigrated illegally. If they were alive today, much like Fred just wondered, I wonder if they would be at risk of deportation. And yet, the family members who were American citizens were incarcerated by their own country, stripped of their freedom and possessions, identity, and dignity. I feel a sense of urgency to continue retelling my family's story because the last generation of camp prisoners is dying off. My mom is really happy that I have this opportunity to share our story today. But it prompts me to pray. How long, oh Lord? Thank you.
Thanks, Fred and Cris. Gosh, this is the power of stories, is we get to see that God is at work, that we have things underneath us in our history and our past that a lot of us just don't even know about. And so maybe a question you're wondering is like, how do I respond to these stories? And I said earlier, we're a Jesus-centered church. And so we want to be a community of people with these kind of stories. We simply ask the question, how would Jesus respond to people in these kind of situations? A few months ago, we talked about this story where Jesus and the disciples find themselves in this interesting scene where there's been a demon-possessed man who's been cast out by his community. And we see this act from Jesus of not fear of the demon-possessed man, but Jesus draws close. And Jesus gets to his face and he asks the man, "What is your name?" Talking about the demons that he was possessed by. And Jesus had this knack over and over again. People on the margins, people cast out, people forgotten about. He would draw close. And he would see their humanity. He'd see their dignity. He'd see the imago Dei. And he'd look into their eyes. What is your name? Child, beloved child of God. And so as a community, that's how we respond as Jesus would. We draw closer. Maybe you have some ideas of what that could look like in your own world, in your neighborhood, or at your school. There's a good chance there's some folks that you could draw closer to. We also have a couple serving opportunities that can just help us get a little more proximate and develop relationships with folks we might not otherwise have. We serve at Hope's Corner the first Wednesday of the month, and we also serve food pantry at Buena Vista. And you can find those opportunities on our website. That might be an opportunity for you. Another potential, this group that Fred mentioned again, that we pray in this room at 8 a.m., that might be a group you would want to consider as we just have bonded together, as we pray and we beg for God's kingdom to come to this earth. That could be an option for you. If you get other ideas, please talk to me, but the important thing is to lean into who Jesus is. And right now we're going to go into a time of communion, and we remember this reality that this king that we serve is not a king who came with power and might. He came with humility. He's a king that laid his life down for the sake of others. And on the night he was betrayed, Jesus sat with his disciples, and he took this bread at the meal, and he said, "This bread is my body, broken for you. Whenever you eat this, do it in remembrance of me." And then he took a cup of wine. He said, "This cup is the cup of my new covenant. Whenever you drink it, do it in remembrance of me." And so we're going to take this communion together, and we're going to remember our King. We're going to remember this Jesus who we are called to be like in this world. Let's pray together. Jesus, we want to thank you for the stories we heard today. I thank you for the courage that took from both of them. I thank you for the vulnerability, the willingness to let us go a little bit on that journey with them. And I pray for just the many situations in our world. I pray that more and more we would, as a church, be called to care more about people than policies. I pray that we would see the humanity in every person. Every picture we see, every video, we'd be drawn more and more to the human dignity and the fact that you call each and every person your child, created in your image. And right now, as we go to the table, I pray that we would be reminded of who you are, the King that laid down his life for us out of love and sacrifice. And then I pray that you would give us this calling and this reminder that this is what we're called to do in the world, to give our lives for the sake of others. We give you this time. Speak to all of us. Amen. Let's take communion together.